The story begins with a small plane flying over the freezing wilderness of Antarctica. On board is our main character, Fu, the CEO of a major company. He's heading deep into Antarctica with a bold business plan. He wants to build a brand new wedding destination in one of the most isolated places on Earth. If everything goes according to plan, his company would be the first to do it, and the potential profits could be enormous. Sitting across from Fu are two women. The first is Natasha, a famous professional model. The second is Xing, a science photographer who has joined the trip to document the remote region. Besides the three passengers, there's also an experienced pilot flying the plane. Because hardly anyone travels to this deserted part of Antarctica, the aircraft is operating with very limited resources. But things quickly take a terrifying turn. As the plane approaches the towering ice-covered mountains, powerful winds suddenly slam into it. The aircraft begins shaking violently, and the turbulence becomes so severe that it looks like they're about to crash straight into a massive mountain. The pilot struggles to control the plane, but the brutal winds completely throw it off balance. Visibility inside the cockpit drops to almost nothing, and before he can react, the plane smashes directly into an icy mountain. The impact kills the pilot instantly. Fortunately, Fu, Natasha, and Xing are still alive. The wreckage breaks apart and plunges down into the frozen wasteland below, finally crashing into the middle of nowhere. All around them is nothing but endless snow, darkness, and an eerie silence. For several moments, nobody knows who survived and who didn't. Eventually, Fu is the first to regain consciousness. He crawls out of the wreckage and looks around, quickly realizing just how isolated they are. They've crashed in a remote section of Antarctica where rescue ships and aircraft almost never pass through unless there's an emergency. Knowing they can't stay outside for long, Fu rushes back into the wrecked plane to find the others. Inside the cabin, he discovers Natasha in terrible condition. Blood is running down her face, but thankfully, her seatbelt has kept her from being thrown around during the crash. Fu immediately unbuckles her and carries her outside to safety. He then goes back inside to search for Xing. Xing is conscious, but there's a major problem. Her leg is trapped beneath a huge piece of twisted metal from the wreckage. Fu tries desperately to free her, but suddenly, the plane begins sinking deeper into the snow and ice. Realizing the entire wreckage could disappear beneath the ice at any moment, Fu panics and runs outside to save himself. But then he hears Xing screaming for help. Fu can't bring himself to leave her behind. Putting his own life at risk, he rushes back into the collapsing wreckage and uses every ounce of strength he has to pull Xing free. The moment they make it outside, the entire plane disappears beneath the ice, and with it goes their only way of contacting the outside world. The plane's radio is now buried beneath the snow, meaning their last hope of calling for help has vanished. Stranded in one of the coldest and most unforgiving places on Earth, Fu and Xing now have no choice but to figure out how to survive on their own. But then they realize something is wrong. Natasha hasn't responded for quite some time. Fu and Xing check on her, only to discover the horrifying truth. The severe injury to her head was fatal. Natasha is dead. Xing immediately breaks down in tears. She refuses to simply leave Natasha's body behind, even though staying there could put both of them in serious danger. Now, with no plane, no radio, no rescue in sight, and the temperature dropping around them, Fu and Xing are completely on their own in the frozen Antarctic wilderness. Following Jing's suggestion, Fu uses the wreckage of the broken plane to make a makeshift stretcher. They carefully place Natasha's body on it and begin moving forward. Jing's leg had been badly injured in the crash, making it almost impossible for her to walk. Like a true companion, Fu takes responsibility for getting her to a safe place. But their journey is far from easy. After walking for a while, they suddenly notice a terrifying avalanche rushing straight toward them. As Jing sees the wall of snow coming down the mountain, she immediately screams that they need to dig a hole in the snow and hide inside it. Fu doesn't waste a second. He starts digging with all his strength. Just as the avalanche gets closer, they jump into the hole and completely cover themselves with snow. Somehow, they manage to survive the avalanche. But in the chaos, Natasha's body is left exposed on the surface. Moments later, predatory birds swoop down and begin tearing at her remains. Once the storm finally passes, Fu climbs out and tells Jing that they have no choice but to bury Natasha there. Carrying such a heavy body any farther would be impossible. With a heavy heart, Jing agrees. Together, they bury Natasha beneath the snow. The moment is devastating for Jing. She had known Natasha for years and had only come on this trip because Natasha convinced her to join. But now Jing was left to face this deadly wilderness almost completely alone. Her injured leg had become so bad that she could barely put any weight on it. Seeing her struggle, Fu decides to carry her on his back and continues through the frozen wilderness. But the rough, slippery terrain makes every step extremely dangerous. They lose their balance and fall several times. Then, while making their way down a steep mountain slope, Fu suddenly slips. Both of them lose their footing and tumble rapidly downhill. During the fall, Jing's injured leg slams into a large rock. The pain is so intense that she loses consciousness. Several hours later, Jing finally opens her eyes and realizes she's inside an old wooden cabin. Seeing a roof over her head gives her a huge sense of relief. She calls out for Fu and finds him sleeping on the floor nearby. Jing sincerely thanks him for saving her life. But then she makes a terrifying request. She tells Fu that her broken leg needs to be pulled straight and reset. Otherwise, the injury could become infected and potentially cost her her life. Fu is terrified, but he knows he has no choice. He grabs Jing's injured leg and pulls with all his strength. The pain is unbearable. Jing screams in agony before losing consciousness again. Fu then does his best to stabilize her leg using wooden splints. Now Jing has no choice but to remain on strict bed rest for at least a few weeks if she wants any chance of recovering. The next morning, Fu tells Jing that he's going to search around the cottage to see if he can find anything useful for their survival. He heads outside and starts exploring the area. Behind the cottage, Fu discovers an old generator. After struggling with it for a while, he somehow manages to get it running. As soon as the generator kicks in, the heater inside the cottage comes back to life. Warm air begins filling the room, finally giving Jing some relief from the brutal cold. Fu then searches through the cabinets and finds several cans of preserved food. There's Chinese writing on the cans, and Jing immediately realizes what this means. The cottage originally belonged to Chinese researchers. That also means China's main Antarctic research station could be somewhere nearby. Fu is thrilled by the discovery and asks Jing if they could simply walk to the research station. But Jing quickly brings him back to reality. She explains that reaching it won't be nearly that easy. After doing the calculations, Jing tells Fu that their canned food supply is extremely limited and will only last a few days. On top of that, there are only about 200 liters of fuel left for the generator. If they run it for just 4 hours a day, that fuel will last them only around 75 days. In other words, they have to make their food, fuel, and every other resource last for a maximum of 75 days. And there's an even bigger problem. Jing explains that Antarctica is currently in its summer season, but the deadly winter is approaching fast. Once it arrives, temperatures could plunge as low as -50 degrees Celsius, making survival almost impossible. Even after hearing all of this, Fu accepts the challenge. They simply have no other choice. Fu promises that every day he'll leave the cottage and search in different directions for the research station. The following day, Jing creates a proper search plan and explains that Fu should only explore 3 specific directions and make sure he returns to the cottage before nightfall. But Fu is too eager to get started. He barely listens to the instructions and heads out on his own. For hours, he wanders across the frozen landscape. But no matter how far he goes, all he can see is endless white snow stretching to the horizon. 3 days pass, yet Fu finds absolutely nothing. He eventually starts following the directions Jing had given him, hoping they might lead him to the station. But those searches end in disappointment too. Still, whenever Fu returns to the cottage in the evening, he puts on a smile and gives Jing false hope. He tells her that he spotted some possible signs during the search, just to keep her spirits from breaking. Then, one day, Fu accidentally reaches a dangerous zone near Antarctica's South Pole. There, he comes face to face with a massive iceberg that looks like it could break apart and collapse at any moment. Fu barely manages to escape with his life. Day after day, he continues searching through the frozen wilderness. Before long, 14 days have passed, and their food supplies are rapidly running out. The sight of this makes Jing tell Fu that he needs to pick up the pace and cover at least 4 kilometers a day. Fu agrees with her. The next morning, Jing feeds him the little food they have left and sends him out with a prayer. But with their food supply running dangerously low, Fu decides he has to find something to eat. Using a sharp metal tool, he cuts a hole through the frozen lake and tries his luck at fishing. Somehow, he actually manages to catch a fish. Fu is thrilled and starts heading back toward the cottage. But on the way, his foot lands on an extremely thin patch of ice. The ice suddenly gives way and Fu screams as he plunges into a deep, freezing crevasse. About 13 hours later, Fu finally regains consciousness. He finds himself trapped inside a dark cave surrounded by towering walls of ice. The terrifying surroundings quickly crush his confidence. The crevasse is so deep that climbing back out without a rope seems almost impossible. Completely hopeless, Fu lies down on the frozen ground. 2 days pass in that deadly pit. Meanwhile, Jing waits anxiously at the cottage for Fu to return. When 2 full days go by without any sign of him, her fear turns into panic. Outside, a brutal snowstorm is raging. Jing realizes that if the heater shuts down, she could freeze to death. Despite her broken leg, she drags herself outside and tries to start the generator. But the extreme cold has completely frozen it, and no matter what she does, it refuses to start. Back in the crevasse, 2 days have passed when Fu suddenly thinks about Jing. He realizes that if he dies down there, Jing will be left alone in the cottage, slowly starving and freezing to death. That thought gives Fu a new reason to survive. He forces himself back onto his feet and notices a tiny crack running up the wall of ice. With his hands and feet already numb from the cold, Fu wedges them into the crack and slowly begins climbing upward. Meanwhile, outside the cottage, Jing has completely lost hope. The generator still won't start, and her hands and feet are beginning to freeze. Jing becomes convinced that Fu is dead. She decides that dying on her own terms would be better than slowly freezing to death alone. She crawls back inside the cottage, takes a sharp blade, and cuts her wrist. Moments later, she loses consciousness and collapses. But at the same time, Fu risks everything and finally manages to climb out of the icy crevasse. Without wasting another second, he runs back toward the cottage. When he arrives, he finds Jing unconscious beside the generator, blood pouring from her wrist. Fu immediately checks her breathing. Thankfully, she's still alive. He carries her inside, bandages her wound, and uses their clothes to keep her warm. When Jing finally wakes up, Fu hugs her and reminds her that they can never give up, no matter how hopeless things seem. After everything they've been through, Jing finally realizes that her feelings for Fu have become something much deeper. She has truly fallen in love with him. By now, they have been trapped inside the isolated cottage for more than 40 days, and the weather is becoming even more deadly. One day, Fu heads out again in search of the station. But by now, the temperature has dropped dangerously low. The constant glare from the snow, combined with the freezing cold, causes Fu to develop snow blindness. His vision starts getting blurry, so he decides to head back toward the cottage. But along the way, his vision suddenly goes completely dark. Now completely blind, Fu starts wandering helplessly across the frozen wasteland. He can't see the cottage anywhere. He keeps stumbling and falling into the snow, desperately screaming for Jing. Luckily, Jing hears his cries. Using a walking stick, she makes her way outside and shouts directions, guiding Fu back toward the cottage. After several painful falls, Fu finally manages to reach the door. Jing immediately hugs him, then wraps a clean cotton cloth around his eyes and tells him to rest. 3 days later, Fu's eyesight slowly begins to return. Once he can see again, he covers his eyes with protective gear and heads back out to search for the station. But this time, disaster strikes again. The frozen surface beneath Fu's feet suddenly begins cracking. Before he can react, the ice gives way, sending him plunging into the freezing waters of the sub-zero ocean below. The water is so cold that Fu immediately struggles to breathe. Worse, a thick layer of ice covers the surface above him, leaving him with no obvious way out. As his oxygen runs dangerously low, Fu begins to panic. Then he notices something moving underwater. A group of penguins is swimming toward a small opening in the ice. Fu follows them, desperately swimming behind the penguins. Somehow he manages to reach the hole and pull himself out of the freezing water. But his nightmare isn't over. His clothes are completely soaked, and the icy winds quickly drain the warmth from his body. Fu begins freezing to death. Still, refusing to give up, he crawls through the snow and somehow makes it all the way back to the cottage. The moment Jing opens the door and sees him, she is horrified. Fu is practically covered in ice, looking like a human snowman. Without wasting a second, Jing strips off his frozen, soaking wet clothes, turns the heater up as high as it will go, and wraps herself around Fu beneath the blankets, using her own body heat to keep him alive. By the next day, Fu's condition finally begins to improve. At this point, the two of them have been surviving inside the isolated cottage for more than 50 days, but their food supplies are almost completely gone. Then, one afternoon, they suddenly hear a knock at the cottage door. Fu and Jing become terrified, thinking there might be a vicious polar bear outside. Fu grabs a metal rod and cautiously opens the door, only to find a tiny, adorable penguin standing there. The little penguin waddles straight inside. Fu tries to chase it away, but Jing instantly falls in love with it and decides to keep it as their pet. Over time, the penguin becomes part of their little cottage family and turns into their closest companion. One day, Fu builds a sled out of wooden planks and takes Jing and the penguin outside for a ride. A few days later, while they are joking around inside the cottage, Jing suddenly gets a severe nosebleed. She explains that they haven't had fresh vegetables for months, and they're starting to show symptoms of scurvy. The next day, Fu takes Jing to a high mountain near the cottage. They sit together and watch the sunset. But as the sun disappears over the horizon, Fu finally loses hope. With tears in his eyes, he admits that he's exhausted and feels like they're destined to die there. Jing takes Fu's hand and tells him, "Maybe I'm meant to die here, but you aren't. You saved my life, and now you have to give our story a beautiful ending." The next morning, Fu sets out one last time in search of the Chinese research station. But along the way, he is caught in a terrifying blizzard. The powerful, icy winds knock him off his feet, and he gets completely buried under the snow. For a moment, it looks like Fu's life is over. But then he remembers Jing's words. Gathering every bit of strength he has left, Fu fights his way through the snow and manages to stand again. He keeps moving forward with barely enough strength to walk. After several exhausting hours, he spots something through the fog, a metal sign. As he gets closer, he realizes what it says. After 55 days of brutal survival, Fu has finally reached the research station. Completely exhausted, he collapses onto the snow. Chinese scientists rush outside, carry him inside, and begin treating him. When Fu finally regains consciousness, his first words are about Jing. He desperately tells them that his companion is still trapped back at the cottage and begs them to rescue her. The rescue team immediately prepares a snow truck and heads toward the cottage with Fu. But just as they approach, disaster strikes. A massive chunk of ice breaks loose from the mountain and crashes directly onto the cottage. Within seconds, the entire building is buried beneath millions of tons of snow and ice. Fu completely loses hope of finding Jing alive. He breaks down, screaming and crying uncontrollably before eventually passing out. The rescue team takes Fu back to the research station and places him in the medical room. Later that night, Fu wakes up and notices the survival book Jing had written lying beside his bed. As he reads through it, he discovers an important instruction. If an avalanche occurs, they should hide inside the underground pit beneath the cottage. Suddenly, Fu realizes there is still a chance Jing survived. He becomes convinced that Jing must have hidden inside that underground shelter before the avalanche hit. Without wasting another second, Fu grabs a snow bike in the middle of the night and races back toward the cottage. When he reaches the area, he searches through the massive piles of snow and eventually discovers a small opening. He looks inside, and there she is. Jing is still alive. Fu pulls her out of the snow and holds her tightly in his arms, overwhelmed with relief. At that exact moment, the sky lights up with a breathtaking display of aurora lights. After everything they endured, Fu and Jing finally realize they have made it through. Their story proves that as long as a person has courage and hope, even death can be overcome. And with that, their incredible survival story comes to an end. So, guys, what did you think of this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Also, subscribe to this channel for more stories like this.